Chapter 48, Unforgiving. Toward the middle part of 2009, I was still housed in Little Max with Turtle, waiting for the next trial to start. By now, I'd been in custody for almost 5 years. A lot of the lower level defendants in the Campo and Ramirez indictments had already played out, but there were still a lot of people thinking about going to trial. Even though everybody knew it would have been suicide to take it to trial, some actually started tinkering with the idea after DB came back with the hung jury. I guess in their minds, this somehow confirmed that these prosecutions were susceptible and that it wasn't a slam dunk after all. For one reason or another, the trial days kept getting pushed back and the years kept passing by. Around this time, my grandmother, my mom's mother, began to ail and needed a full-time in-home caretaker. She was pushing 90 and was almost to the point where she could no longer care for herself. My mom's apartment was just around the corner from her house, so as my grandmother's health deteriorated, my mom eventually moved in with her. One evening, I got an emergency message from the jail chaplain telling me to call home in regards to my grandmother. As soon as I got the message, I expected the worst and assumed my grandmother's condition had worsened. When I finally called, my mom answered and said that my grandmother had suffered a mild heart attack and had been admitted into the hospital. She said that the doctors wanted to do a triple bypass, but my grandmother was so old and frail that they weren't sure if her body could sustain that type of trauma. To make matters worse, her mental state was also slipping away. She didn't want to go forward with the procedure and began talking about going home to be with my grandfather. He passed away back in the late 70s, and she had been a devoted widow ever since. Honestly, in her condition, I didn't blame her because her quality of life had diminished so vastly she was merely suffering. She could barely see, her hearing was degrading, she was bedridden most of the time, and for her, life held little purpose. My mom wanted me to call my grandmother on a three-way at the hospital, just in case I didn't get another chance to talk to her, and she seemed convinced that she wasn't coming home one way or the other. I was already dreading this because I was close to my grandmother and didn't want to call feeling like this might actually be the last time I'd hear her voice. But I forced myself to call, and as selfish as it may have been, I pleaded with her not to give up and to keep fighting. I told her that we weren't ready to let her go and that I couldn't bear the thought of losing anyone else after having gone through what I did with Vicky. She promised me that she would, but I could tell by listening to her that she was tired and almost ready to go. She was trying not to let me hear it in her voice. After talking with her, I called my mom back. I asked her to do everything she could to keep my grandmother's spirits up and to talk to her about the surgery. My mom said that she actually signed the DNR, do not resuscitate, and this was something we had to respect, as we couldn't force her to stay alive. But miraculously, her condition improved a few days later, and they were allowed to bring her back home. From that day on, I made it a point to talk to my grandmother at least once a week for a few minutes whenever I called my mom. For the past 5 years since I've been in jail, I call my mom every Tuesday and Friday night, or at least twice a week. We've always been very close, and these calls were important for both of us. Even though she was barely getting by, she always kept money on the phone and made sure I was able to call whenever I needed to talk. We kept each other's spirits up and stayed connected. Although she was taking care of my grandmother, my mom was battling health problems of her own. She had chronic gastronitis and emphysema from years of smoking. Sometimes when she slipped into her deep depressions, she started saying some of the same things Vicky used to tell me before she passed away. When my mom started talking like that, I get really upset and warned her to never give up or ever think about doing that to me. I kept reminding her that she remained a huge part of what I was doing and she needed to be there to see me the day I made it back. Besides that, my grandmother needed her, so she needed to be strong for her too. On November 13, 2009, I called my mom like I did every Tuesday night. She sounded really depressed because of my grandmother, who by now was barely eating and had begun talking about going home to be with my grandfather again. At the time, I tried lifting her spirits by telling her that the other 2 trials I was waiting for would be starting soon and that it wouldn't be long before I made it back home to help her. But again, I was just trying to keep her pacified by trying to find anything that would make my situation seem like it was getting better than it was. In all actuality, these 2 trials kept getting postponed and I had no idea when they were really going to start. Before we hung up, she assured me that my grandma was okay, and I said I'd call again on Friday night. The following night, about 2 a.m., one of the tier officers came to my gate and woke me up. He said, "Mendoza, the chaplain needs to talk to you." My heart sunk. I knew at that moment that my grandmother had finally lost her battle and that I would never see her again. I felt sick inside, the same dreaded feeling I got when I knew Vicky was gone. After I was chained up and escorted down to the chaplain's office, I sat down in front of her and braced myself for what I knew was to come. Even though I knew my grandma was gone, I had hoped the chaplain was going to tell me that she was back in the hospital, so I could at least talk to her one more time. Then I heard the words that literally shook my whole world. She said, "I'm sorry, John, but your mom's sister, Gladys, found your mother's body early this morning, and there was nothing they could do to save her. She was already gone." I was stunned. Maybe she made a mistake and meant my grandmother. The loss wouldn't have been any better, but she couldn't be talking about my mom. I had just talked to her. I asked, "Are you sure you're not talking about my grandmother?" She then pulled out a piece of paper she'd written the message on and showed it to me. The message was from my mom's sister and it clearly read, "Mother, Patricia Mendoza, passed away Wednesday morning, November 14, 2009. I couldn't believe it. Everything around me started spinning. I felt lightheaded and nauseous. The chaplain said if I wanted to make a three-way call to anyone, she'd pull me out early in the morning. I said, "No, I'm okay. Thank you anyway." Then she asked if I wanted to talk or pray with her. I said, "Thank you anyway. I just wanted to go back to my cell." This particular chaplain named Evelyn was a really nice lady and remembered me from when Vicky passed away. But I just didn't want to talk to anyone. I was too devastated. I couldn't even think straight. I just wanted to go back to my cell and be alone. When I got back to my cell, I sunk into another deep depression that literally lasted for weeks. I couldn't sleep for 3 days straight. I hadn't even finished grieving over Vicky, and it had already been 31 months since she passed. All I did was think about every memory I ever shared with my mom. The good times, the bad times, I went through all of them. Losing a mother is indescribable. This is someone that's been with you for your entire life, a lifelong companion, someone who's closer to you than anyone else. I felt some of the same emotions I felt when I lost Vicky. Abandon, sadness, anger, shock, despondency, emptiness, and an overpowering feeling of being all alone. Although I do believe in a higher power, I've never been a religious person. But as I did when Vicky passed, I got down on my knees that night and asked God, how could you be so cruel and unforgiving? How could you take the two most important people in my life away from me at a time like this? I felt like I was being punished and tormented. This was far worse than any prison sentence or anything else these people could do to me. My mom and Vicky were both good people with good hearts. They were completely undeserving of being taken away at such young ages. Vicky passed away 8 days after her 40th birthday, and my mom passed away a month before her 57th birthday. I couldn't understand how a God could be so unforgiving. Good, innocent people always suffer and are prone to tragedy, while bad people seem to prosper and go on to live long lives. These questions continue to live with me till this day. The first call I made the following day was to my stepfather, another difficult and emotional call. It was the first time in my entire life that I actually heard him break down and cry. All he kept saying was, "I'm sorry, Johnny. I can't believe that she's gone either." Talking to my grandmother was just as hard. I avoided talking to her for a few days, but knew I'd eventually have to get it over with. Plus, I didn't want to take the chance of losing her before we got that closure. She also broke down, and it just tore at my heart to hear her like that. My mother's death was accidental. Her doctors put her on medication that made her real sleepy, so she started spending a lot of time lying in bed. On the morning of her passing, she apparently nodded off and suffocated in a pillow. Knowing that her death was premature and avoidable made my grief that much more harder and difficult to accept. My stepfather and other members of my family had the unpleasant experience of packing up her apartment and putting her stuff away. I don't know how my stepfather managed to endure such a burdensome task, but somehow he did. Packing up every box would have made me feel like I was sending a part of her away, and each box would be like I was saying goodbye all over again. As I did with Vicky, I continued to dial my mom's number for weeks until the phone was finally shut off. Again, it served as some sort of palpable lifeline in my mind. I wouldn't allow myself to believe that she was really gone until the recording kicked on. This number has been disconnected. On February 23, 2010, almost 3 months after my mom passed away, my grandmother was also taken away from me. I couldn't believe that these 3 people were actually gone. They were practically my whole family, and they were all I had. I have other family members, but I'm not close to any of them. I basically felt like I'd lost everyone. Even though I had braced myself for my grandmother's passing, it still didn't make it any easier. I honestly believe that she was so devastated over losing my mom that it had accelerated her passing. She was heartbroken, and I know she missed her. Out of all her kids, my mom was the only one who took care of her and was always there for her. My uncles and aunts never came around, as they were too concerned with their own lives. I think I saw them once when I was about 7 years old. During the time I was still being bounced around in foster care. Other than that, I didn't even know them. Once again, I went through this unsavory ritual of calling her number for the next couple weeks until I got that recording. When I sat back and really thought about how much this changed my life and how things would be if I ever made it back out, it was disheartening. My mom and grandmother's homes were a part of me. They've been associated with me for my entire life, but now they were being reduced to just past memories. If I ever saw these places again, they'd only represent an empty shell. Memories from a distant past, and undoubtedly these houses would now be occupied by complete strangers. A couple weeks after their passing, I was scheduled to testify in another case against Jeremy Lopez Paisley. Prior to Chris Chino Clip's defection, he had managed to gather several kites that included written reports by Lopez himself. Most of these other guys who were getting indicted had become real wary of putting their names on anything, but Lopez wasn't one of them. Apparently, he was given a position within the jail and was responsible for submitting weekly rosters, IRs, incident reports, and new arrival information. Along with these reports, there was also an additional report written by Lopez. This particular report detailed the identities of his COC, chain of command, his progress, and other policies he was implementing in that part of the jail. In this same kite, Lopez referenced a bed move that took place within the jail a day before the kite was written. This particular move was significant because it occurred within his housing unit and narrowed down the origin of where this kite came from. Instead of delegating someone under him to rewrite these reports for him, he was foolish enough to send them outdated, uncoded, and with his name clearly written at the end. This would end up being a mortal mistake. When Chino handed these kites over to Sergeant Livingston and Sergeant Lewis, they were able to ascertain that Lopez had written one of the kites based on the reference bed move and other identifying information. After reviewing the kites and conducting a brief investigation, Sergeant Lewis and Sergeant Livingston then filed a criminal complaint against Lopez for conspiracy and participating in a criminal street organization. Due to the fact that he lost his first trial with Kramer and Looney, and he was loaded up with 4 strikes, he was now eligible for a life sentence under the 3 strikes law. Once again, I was called in as an expert witness and basically connected all the dots for the prosecuting attorney, David Pandori. Aside from the usual history, the structure, and the internal workings, all I had to do was explain to the jury how rosters benefited the NF. That was the crux of the entire case. Once that correlation was established, the rest was history. After I finished testifying, Sammy and Turtle were called in next to testify. At the conclusion of the trial, the jury came back with a guilty verdict on both charges. A few months later, at his sentencing hearing, Lopez was given a 45-year to life sentence under the 3 strikes law. This case right here definitely set the bar and demonstrated how effective some of the gang statutes had become, as receiving a life sentence behind getting caught up with the roster was almost unheard of. A couple months after Lopez was convicted, DB and the last remaining defendant, Michael Raton Ortiz, were preparing to start their trial. After having received a hung jury in his first trial, DB was smug about his upcoming trial and even began referring to himself as the Teflon Don. Again, I was qualified as an expert witness. After having been through 2 trials and 2 grand jury hearings, you would have thought that testifying would get a little easier for me, but it didn't. I still got nervous and I still felt that overpowering claustrophobic feeling every time just before walking into the courtroom. This time, I testified for 4 days straight, going tit for tat with two of the most unscrupulous attorneys I'd ever been questioned by. DB had the same attorney who represented him in his first trial, and this guy made a habit out of taking cheap shots and being overly critical of how I deceived Vicky. He accused me of fabricating and embellishing all my testimony, proclaiming, "You lied and deceived your wife. Why wouldn't you lie and deceive this jury?" At first, I allowed this to bother me, and I'm sure I was visibly angry, but I composed myself and let him dig a big hole for DB. There's no question that he did this to rattle me and keep me off balance, but eventually I just let it roll right off me. In the end, this didn't help DB because the jury wasn't amused by his courtroom antics or the unprincipled tactics that he displayed. And since he was representing DB, the ill-boding effects ultimately fell on him. If the jury doesn't like the defense lawyer, they don't like the defendant either. That's just the way it works. After I finished testifying, Turtle, Monster, and Joe all went in next. This trial lasted about a month, but this time DB wasn't so lucky. The jury came back with guilty verdicts on all charges after deliberating for only a few short hours. Raton would later get sentenced to 14 years with 2 strikes, whereas DB was given 149 years to life. Prior to this trial, Turtle had actually been released under the terms that he must return and testify once this trial started. At that point, he had basically fulfilled the terms of his agreement, so he was released into the district attorney's relocation program. But after facing a lengthy prison sentence, this demonstrated to some of the other cooperating witnesses that their faith and trust in everything they were doing may actually have been well placed. Enrique Puerco Rodriguez, Jesse Conejo Rodriguez, Isaac Lefty Lastra, David Gato Lastra, and Andrew Drew Perez were all released from custody following the 2 grand jury indictments.